Stacy, where are we?
You're in the middle, George. You got the.
This looks one way or the other. Or you can do it from here.
I can do it from there, but
You'd rather sit.
I'll stand back here. All right, there we go.
Okay, well, great. Take a look at this
Oh, you can stand.
all-star panel that's trying to figure out their seating chart. You've already read some real dignitary, I mean, some folks in the industry that are really impressive, but this is above and beyond that. And I'm going to let Rob handle the introductions, but one of our major sponsors, Maass, Rogerse, and Lindsay, of course, are always good friends of IYBA. We know we can count on them. And Rob is a shareholder in Maass, Rogerse, and Lindsay. Full-service law firm with offices in Palm Beach, Stewart, holds an AB from Princeton and a JD from Yale. And Mr. Maass heads the firm's Admiralty Department. So, ladies and gentlemen, Robb Maass.
Good morning. Well, every year we do this seminar, and one of the comments that we get repeatedly is, why don't we talk more about smaller boats? And this segment is not entirely on smaller boats, but we are going to go through various size ranges and discuss the differences that come into play with each category of boat. And we have with us today George Jousma, who is the CEO of the Italian Yacht Group, formerly CEO of Allied Richard Bertram and San Lorenzo of the Americas, right?
Yep.
Got that right? Okay. And then next to him is Stacy Perry, who is our firm's senior paralegal and has been keeping me in line for 24 years.
I think so.
Ugh. Next is Laura Sherrod, or
Did it right.
Sherrod as her French family is known. She's with Private Insurance Services. She's been in town for a long, long time with a number of different agencies, C.A. Hansen, I believe,
Yes.
and then
People don't
Brown
know
and
that.
Brown,
Yes.
Atlas.
Yes.
Okay, so she's done it all. And then we have Bob Allen, who is the genius behind Robert Allen Law. We deal with Bob and his team on very often, and they're among our favorite adversaries. So let's get to it. David, you have the first. Yeah, deals of every size. There we go. Okay, we're going to start with less than 32 feet, and this is not so much something that lawyers deal with, at least in terms of buying a vessel under 32 feet for personal use. And we get into it more when we're talking in the context of tenders, and we'll get into that a little bit, just because it's something that comes up in our practice frequently. And let me start with George. I mean, that's sort of at the low end of any range that you've been involved in, but what do you see as some of the particular issues and concerns that arise with boats of that size?
You're correct. It's been a while since we've done a lot of transactions in that range, but we are doing more of them that are related to, as you say, tenders or tow-behind boats. And that gets, like we just had a situation the other day where the larger boat was in charter, and what did we need to do to keep the tow-behind boat in the same context with the charter situation and on charter, and some of the complications that could come with that with reference to how it would be built. Something we just came up with recently. But, and flagging related to the larger boat.
Yeah, no, we see that quite often too. If you have a tender that's being used as part of a charter package, you have to make sure that it's done in a way that's lawful in the flag state. So that does happen. Typically, we see these owned by individuals. Stacy, you've had the discussion with clients about individual versus LLC, and at this size range, what are you telling them?
Still LLC if they go for it. Not everyone does. The way we generally see them are as tenders as well. So a situation we just ran into is we were given information on a less than 32, and one of the digits of the whole number was incorrect. So we sold the boat incorrectly to someone who then went to sell it and came back and said, oh, this is Florida titled. And we said, well, no, it's not. And they said, well, yes, it is. And had to do a lot of investigating. So I think making sure that anything under 32 is properly registered, titled, however they want to do it. It doesn't matter as long as it is registered, especially if it's here in Florida.
Now, has the statute of limitations run on that malpractice claim?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, we can talk about it.
No, it's fixed now.
All right, well, good. And something that, well, I'll let Bob talk about what we get to. Let's go with Laura for a minute and talk about some of the insurance issues you see with the smaller boats.
So, believe it or not, there's a lot of markets for boats under 32 feet, even in Florida, because State Farm, Allstate, Progressive, Geico, they're all in that space. They're fairly comfortable with it. What's funny about it is they care more about your credit score than they do about your boating history. They care more about whether you're married. And so it's kind of funny because those are the parameters that they say, okay, well, if you've got a good credit score, you're probably going to take care of this little boat. Not really taking into account some of the actual risk that's involved in it. They treat it like an auto. They underwrite it like an auto. Now, for this room, almost all of you all probably deal with it again as tenders. And there's just a few things that I'd like to mention is because the LLC is typically insurable with the yacht, right? But it makes it a problem, obviously, if you're trying to insure a little boat for a State Farm and an Allstate and all those people. They don't insure crew. They don't insure your liabilities correctly. So just remember, if it's going to be used as a tender, don't take the easy route and go put it in a progressive policy, because then you're just not really getting coverage for your client. So, or we're not.
And what about coverage under an umbrella policy if you choose to have it owned by an LLC, the policies in your name individually?
That is actually company specific, depending on their underwriting guidelines. So the LLC can be put under the umbrella, but it depends on whether or not the umbrella is going to pick up the crew liability, for example. Mm-hmm. If it's a big package, AIG probably will.
So they'll endorse on the LLC?
Yes.
Okay.
But it is something that has to be underwritten, so it's not an automatic.
Yeah, no, we've had that problem. The other problem we see with umbrellas is size limitations on boats.
Yes, speed and size. So size does matter, by the way. So we, if it's over a certain length, over a certain horsepower, it does have to actually be underwritten. So.
And generally, what kind of length are we talking about?
Again, it's carrier specific, so it could be that they say 26 feet is our max. It could be 17 feet. So it really does it has to go back to your agent and has to go back to the underwriter to determine what's in there.
Yeah, and that is something to keep in mind, that clients sometimes say, oh, I'll just put it, I have a base insurance and then we just put it under my umbrella policy.
Yeah.
But that doesn't always work, so you got to be careful.
Yeah, it really is company specific. So every carrier in marine insurance comes up with their own language. So you can't just automatically say, oh, it's covered. So you have to read the policy.
Thank you. And Bob, where do you come down on the individual versus LLC ownership on boats this size?
Well, not really sure, Rob.
Just say anything.
Yeah. In general, I want to stick an insulator in between any threat and a risk, right? So My natural inclination as a lawyer is to put it in an LLC. But it's a pain in the neck. It's a pain in the neck.
Yeah.
And a lot of banks don't like it, insurers don't like it. And at the end of the day, if you get enough insurance, you're going to be fine having it in your own name. Now, once you get above this size, once you get into a sport fish and things like that, there's no way I would have it in an individual's name. So anyway, it's you could go either way on this. It's just because most people have them, in their backyard, and they're towing them, and it's who needs an LLC? I mean, I'll make an extra $1,000 or something if we form one, but it's just too much of a pain in the neck.
Do you guys have a strong preference for Coast Guard documentation versus state title?
On about this size?
Yeah.
Well, first of all,
if you can get
you have an issue with Coast Guard documentation because the boat has to be at least 5 net, not gross, net tons to be able to document it. And depends on the configuration of the boat, obviously, but that usually kicks in somewhere around 28 feet,
Right.
more or less. And I don't know. I mean, more often than not, we see these state titled.
Do lenders push the U.S. document?
Lenders always want to be U.S. documented when they can, and the reason for that is that you can only get a preferred ship mortgage on a documented vessel, so they'll always push you in that direction. But the other thing I want to point out, with regard to the individual versus LLC issue at this size, is that if it's an LLC, but you, the owner, are at the wheel, and something bad happens, you're still liable. I mean, the LLC really is more of a protection when you have a larger boat that you're likely to have a captain, someone other than yourself at the wheel, so that there is true limited liability. But I do think more often than not, except when we're talking about tenders to a larger boat, you can see these individually owned. So we also have noted that no broker's license is required to sell a boat this size. And later we'll be talking about larger boats, and interestingly, boats over 300 gross tons don't require a broker's license to sell. So it's only between those two links that you have to worry about being licensed. Okay, well let's go on, David. Okay, now we're talking about between 32 and 79. Okay, why did we pick 79 feet as the upper end of this range? And the answer is 79 feet, which corresponds to 24 meters, is a dividing line for a number of purposes. For example, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but the cutoff for a simple measurement of a boat, not requiring a classification society survey, is 79 feet, 24 meters in those offshore flags like the Cayman Islands that recognize simplified measurement. Though of interest in the US, 79 feet is LOA, length overall, whereas internationally, 24 meters is your load line length, which is somewhere in between. Now, George, this is a size range that you've been active in. I mean, you're doing a lot of larger boats too. What do you see as different once you get up to this range?
I would say that the biggest issue we've been dealing with lately and slightly above this range has been all of the EPA stuff and trying to import and potentially pay duty on some of the foreign-built boats and chasing our tail, as you know, on a lot of those documents and what can be done and not done.
All right, well, I'm not sure everyone in this room knows what you mean by EPA issues.
Okay.
I know more than I'd like to know.
Yeah.
But go ahead and tell us what you're talking about.
Well, you've got in particular, we're dealing with the emissions issues and chasing Tier 3 EPA emissions control on newer vessels to be able to pay duty on, and maybe US flagged boat versus not US flagged boat. And it's more relevant on sizes larger than this, but it's become very taxing.
Yeah, no, and part of the problem we're seeing is that on older boats, well, let me back up. To be able to import a boat through customs, border protection, into the US, the engines have to meet EPA emission standards. And to make things worse, the EPA emission standards are different than the IMO standards for which you obtain an EIA PP, an Engine International Air Pollution Certificate. And the requirement that you prove that the boat is compliant with the EPA requirements as a condition to importation didn't really come to the fore until a few years ago. And on older boats, people were able to import them whether they were compliant or not, simply because they weren't asked. Now they're asked. And on some of the older boats, they don't comply. So what do you do then, George?
Punt.
Punt.
Oh, you?
It's 561-659-17.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
You deal with the workarounds as best you can. You talk about, potentially foreign flagging, some issues like that people in this size range are a little naive about. Maybe somebody moving up, and it sometimes becomes difficult because they're like, this should be an easy process. I want to buy a boat, I want to have fun, and why am I having to deal with so much regulation and so much difficulty? What do you mean foreign flag and
right? I
issues?
just want my boat.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could speak up,
Go ahead,
it's kind of funny because a few years ago, before Florida imposed the sales tax cap, everybody had a foreign flag, and all you had to tell them is, you can save a bunch of money on taxes, and bang, foreign flag the boat in this range all the time.
Yeah.
But now that that's gone, it's a pain in the neck to foreign flag it. So.
And why was it that foreign flag boats were not subject to the tax?
Why was it?
That foreign flag boats weren't subject to the tax.
Can you call David and have him answer that? Because they weren't imported in the United States. They'd come in on a temporary.
That's essentially it. That the state.
There was this fiction, right?
Yes, it was a fiction.
That boats that are here on a foreign flag can stay here for a year, and
They were here temporarily, and
right, and then they
not
leave.
Subject to our use tax.
Right, you take them to the Bahamas, clear customs, and then come back and get your permit again, and that's the way it works. But with the sales tax cap, the need for tax savings has been eliminated.
Yeah, it's tax avoidance, not evasion. But no, it was, and you've seen all kinds of boats the size. And just a little aside is that I do a lot with the Cayman Islands Shipping Registry, and after the cap came in, they were noticing this huge outflow of vessels from the registry, and the answer was that these were Americans coming home. They no longer needed the foreign flag to avoid the sales tax. They paid the capped amount, $18,000, and then they're done. But going back to the EPA and EIAPP, we've had a lot of people probably in this room get upset when we have required a seller to provide an EIAPP certificate. And why do we do that, Stacy?
Because we like to annoy them?
Yes.
Because we have to. It's illegal for a boat to be traveling around without one, depending on the requirements, engine output, and when you go to sell the boat, somebody else is going to ask you for it. And if you didn't tell your buyer, hey, you're required to have these, and he goes to sell it, and somebody else is like, now you have to provide these, and you're looking at $10,000, $15,000, and they're going to say, okay, well, you take it out of your commission because you never told me.
Yeah, it's all engines above 130, all diesel engines above 130 kilowatts, which is not a very large engine, have to have the EIAPP. And as Stacy said, it really, I don't think I know of anyone who's ever been stopped for not having an EIAPP certificate. So the greatest practical concern is that you're going to be asked for it in the next round, and so you better have it. Laura, what do you see on some of the insurance issues in this size range?
So this is an interesting size range because you have a lot of owner-operators still, you know, and as we were talking about, 25% of the new buyers this year were first-timers. And so first-timers has been a big problem for us. Also, just the absentee owner aspect of it, because what insurance carriers think of as absentee owner isn't what you and I would think. If you own a second home, you're considered an absentee owner. Well, most people who can afford a 79-foot boat have a second home. So it creates a problem. A lot of people aren't honest with their insurance agents, actually. I think we do a lot of education when they find out that they have one market available because they're considered absentee owner, and it turns out that they'll go to the next agent and they won't mention their other home. This happens a lot, actually.
Just the fact that you have a home, not how often you're there? Or?
Just the fact that you have a home, because there's an assumption that you're not going to be there during hurricane season, here during hurricane season. And we've got some canes over here, right? So we have that problem. The other major problem has been over the last years, as Jason was mentioning, you know, we had 35 carriers, now we have basically one insurer that will do absentee owners in South Florida right now. And so there's a very, very constricted marketplace. And so you know, we get a lot of those phone calls from clients that say, you know, you're the worst person in the world. I'm never going to do the. And then a week later, they call, hi, I'd like to talk about that insurance policy again. Because they find out that the marketplace really is that tight. So we struggle with this. The third part is when the insurance company finds that absentee owner or the first timer, and they say that they have to have a full-time captain.
Yeah, I was about to ask that, because in the next category, that's definitely a factor. But
yes,
even in this category, as you get up towards 79 feet, I imagine that becomes more and more of an issue.
Absolutely, because the captain issue is you just really don't have enough experience to run this boat, but your
Right.
broker wants to sell it. And I understand that. I understand you want to sell a boat, but it happens a lot, and some brokerages are doing a great job as far as educating their clients before they go and buy a $4 million brand new boat that they are going to now actually have to have a full-time captain for.
What length do you see that kicking in typically?
Really over 60s, in the 60s to 80s.
We had it once recently in the 50s. And
For a first timer.
Yes.
I can see that.
Yeah.
I can see that. Yeah.
And was that for a full-time captain or a management company?
It was more like a learner's permit. You had, in our case, you had to have a captain on board when you were operating the boat. You
Understood,
didn't have to have a captain.
but it wasn't a full-time captain.
Correct.
Right.
Didn't have to be.
Right. So that's a difference. Big difference is captain on board while operating. A lot of people can live with because
Right.
they actually want that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But a captain full-time, no other job is what the American carriers are saying you must have.
Really?
In order to write the policy.
So
Yeah.
you part-time captains.
Even at this length.
Even at this length,
Right.
which is very frustrating,
Very,
obviously.
because most people with a 60-foot boat think that if I have enough experience, then I don't need a captain.
Well,
Exactly.
but I think the proper solution, I mean, I get the insurers are smarter than I am, but if you own a boat up to this size, you ought to be able to run with a captain on board, right? And
I would
some
think.
sort of a maintenance, a regular checking of the boat by a maintenance company, as opposed to having a full-time captain.
So it goes back to, and historically, we've had carriers who have said, we will do that arrangement. We will do the yacht manager who, takes care of the boat.
And when you're on board, puts a captain.
And when you're on board, puts a captain. But, and I can name Ace and Chubb, and some of the travelers and some of the other domestic carriers that said, we're not getting enough protection for our hurricane exposure. And so we're just not going to do that anymore in Florida. And so the challenge is find the carrier who is okay with the fact that this absentee owner or now a full-time owner, full-time Florida, good experience, not a problem.
Not a problem. Right.
But that, again, we're talking the first-timers and we're talking the absentees. Those are the ones that are really, really a challenge for us right now.
And what are they requiring with respect to hurricane mitigation issues and
Good hurricane plans,
Uh-huh.
but not necessarily dictating that the boat must be, in
above a certain latitude or?
Yeah. I mean, there are carriers that will say we're only going to write boats that are out of, north-south risks.
Right.
But that's limiting your client as well, right? And, the person, and we get a lot of phone calls on June 1st to say, oh, I didn't take the boat north because now can you just endorse it, fix it. And you can't.
No.
You got to change the policy over to another carrier and things like that. So, yeah, that's
Something to keep in mind.
I have a quick question. I haven't experienced it, but I wonder if we get to a situation where insurance becomes a condition in the PSA.
We've actually talked about it, but we've talked
since
about.
the market is so
Right.
difficult, people go down the line and find out at the end, wait a minute, I don't have options for insurance. And
Yeah.
maybe they're already pregnant.
We talked about it, but the reality is we write this agreement for the brokerage industry, right? And so the idea is not to be overprotective. We want to be fair, but not overprotective. So
We should always put that in an addendum. I mean, that's something, for example, that I always do in those rare occasions when we're dealing with a wooden boat.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
well, without even putting in an addendum, we require during the free look period that all of our attorneys say, okay, let's line up the insurance in advance. You can't accept a boat even conditionally without insurance. And we've actually put in, insurance into the conditional acceptance at some
We've
point.
had where I think we were on the seller side where a buyer wasn't able to place insurance and the seller was like, well, it's not a condition of closing.
And it
So
wasn't.
what do you do then?
Yeah, I mean, you have to, if you're a buyer without a lender, you at least have the option of going there until you can find coverage. But George, something I want to ask you, this question that a lot of us have had, is that during COVID, instead of seeing a dead market in this size range, we saw an explosion. And I know you've seen that. What do you attribute that to? Why are people buying all of a sudden?
Jason spoke about it earlier. I think, initially we saw like, what are we going to do? People had the financial means and said, we can't travel, we can't do things. So we attracted, obviously, all these first-time boaters into the marketplace. But now I see it being sustainable. I think it created out of
If you have
COVID
the product.
If you have product, that's clearly become a different problem at this point. But it was spoken about earlier quite a bit. But I hope we have
I
the
missed that
sustainability.
session, but you think we're going to see this for a while?
I do. My telltale to that is, we do a fair amount of new boat construction stuff. Is just to see the pipeline of stuff that's going to deliver. And I'm not talking, personally, we're talking stuff 50, 60 feet in some cases. Yes, high end, but people are willing to wait 18 months, 24 months to be building product in that range. That's why I have hope that I think there's some sustainability. And there's a huge backlog in all of those manufacturers from that standpoint.
Yeah, I agree entirely with George. At first it was, we can't go on the cruise, we can't go to Europe, but it's kind of, I hate to use the term, but it's infectious, right? These guys, their friends are buying boats. And so at first it was this New York billionaire that never owned a boat that needs to have a Fed ship. And then it started to be their friends who'd been on the boat. And then their friends. And it's just kind of, I think that this, unless there's a total implosion in the economy, I think this is...
That's
Yeah.
what we were talking this way in 2000 for
Right.
those of us who were living through that experience. In 2007 and into 2008, it was like, is there any end to this? Because
But at the same time, you and I have had this conversation, whereas if your focus is on new boat sales, then you're going to get whacked pretty good. But used boat sales are going to continue. The price will come down,
Yeah.
but the market
adjusts.
stays. The market stays. So, and with the increased volume of boats out there, I think it may not be boom times, but it's not going to be depression in the yacht industry, in the yacht brokerage industry. I can't see that at all.
Well, although we did see, like in 2001 after 9/11, and in 2008 after Lehman Brothers, those were such sudden and huge events that the market was totally frozen for a while. You couldn't give a boat away. So absent something like that, God forbid, I think you're right. It's not going to just all of a sudden stop. So, well, let's move on. Let's go next to the between 79 and 300. Okay. This, Laura, getting back to the insurance issues here, you're going to have a captive. I mean, aren't you? No matter how experienced you are, is any
Yes.
lender going to allow an owner to drive his own boat?
Very few, and now
Sure.
you're getting into the expert range as far as underwriters. They know what they're doing in this range. They know the products. They're actually pretty good at it. One thing I actually add to what Jason was saying again, he's talking about losing people out of the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I think is very interesting is in this 79 to 300 gross ton range, we have a lot of older product, right? Older boats, they last a long time because they're originally well built. The engine problem is a major issue, and that's service issue because we're getting vessels that are coming out of service and having a claim. And that's actually we expect to have attritional losses. We expect things to happen where people are running into things and lightning and things like that. But it should be that when a boat is serviced that it's okay. And it's not. And we're having shortages in the service industry that are creating claims. And so I just want to I hope I'm not opening a can of worms, but it seems to me that we really, as an industry, need to help or continue to build out all of the services that are available for clients so that they want to stay in boating, so that they want to continue to buy another boat, that it's a good experience. And service is a big part of it that I think we're missing. Mm-hmm. And it's going to affect insurance as well.
Well, one of the things I've seen with older boats too is that when you look at the cost of maintaining and operating the boat compared to its value, it really gets out of hand.
Yes.
And so there's more and more incentive, I suppose, for an owner to maybe cut corners.
So that really affects the insurance as well. So when you have a boat that was originally built and it was a $20 million boat, and today it's selling for $2 million, it's very hard to insure because if you have a partial loss, it's basically a CTL, a constructed total
Right.
loss. And there's not enough premium in it for underwriters to feel comfortable that they're not going to actually end up losing money on that account, so they just don't write them. So we have a very, very small number of, very small capacity for writing older boats.
Mm-hmm. And Stacy, what are you seeing from a transactional perspective with boats in this size range?
Well, this market, I feel, has blown up through COVID. I think for a long time, we didn't really do anything under 100 for a while. So I think the biggest difference, though, when you get to 300 and up, you have very experienced owners, or at least management teams that understand what needs to happen. From 79 to 300, you're looking at guys who are still first-time buyers, don't understand the market, don't understand EIPPs or certain certificates or licensing requirements or how insurance is going to work. So they tend to be a lot more difficult. You need to do a lot more hand-holding in this section because they're just not as experienced as when you get into the larger yachts, unless it's a guy that already owns one.
Involved. You see fewer managers involved.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's definitely the case.
Yeah.
And just to make clear why we picked 300 gross tons as the upper end of this range, I mean, otherwise we're talking about feet to this point, is at 300 gross tons, you're what under US law is called a seagoing motor vessel. And a seagoing motor vessel has to comply with US inspection requirements, which deal with how the boat is built, not just what life-saving equipment it has on board. And we'll get into this more as we get up over 300, but that's the issue here. What do you think, Stacy, the breakdown between US documentation and foreign in this size range?
I think currently 60-40 US until we get closer, I would say. I mean, especially right now.
I would have thought it was a little bit lower US, but were you seeing that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, depending on crew, because that changes the whole.
Yeah, I mean, if they want to have foreign crew.
If they want to have foreign crew, it's not even an option, so.
Yeah, although getting into too deeply in the weeds, there's some ways of dealing with that too. And George, are you seeing a different type of buyer in this range, or are these primarily people that had smaller boats that are moving up?
No, we've seen a lot of first-time people enter the market in this range. In fact, I'm 40 years in the industry, and again, Jason talked about it earlier, but we've seen a lot of things for the first time. But it's mind-blowing to see how many first-time buyers are coming into this range, and young. And a lot of it has been because of friendships or associations that they've got with their peers that own boats, and you need to have a boat.
And these are people from all walks of life. I mean,
yeah, it's amazing how much wealth there is out there.
Yeah.
That
That's something I always said, that buying a boat has less to do with money, because there's always been money. It's more to do with attitude. And if you have to want a boat. And if you want a boat, there's plenty of people out there who can pay for one.
It's been a lot of work because they potentially are buying 5, 10, $15 million assets in this range, and they don't know the steps, and you're trying to make a sale, but also educate, with what the process is. And so it's more work than if it was an experienced buyer.
And
for sure.
What percentage of the
crew,
buyers you think are working with a lawyer in that size range?
Pardon?
What percentage of the buyers you think are working with a lawyer?
In our situation, I would say we're doing 4 out of 5 of our transactions are involving law firms.
Involving firms. Okay.
Yeah, even this range. Even.
Yeah.
I mean, 10 years ago, you would never think about buying a 40 or 50-foot boat and involving a lawyer, and now, it's probably 4.
10 years ago, you weren't paying a couple million for it, or
correct,
whatever it is now.
And yeah, so almost all the transactions at this point, at least one side has got a lawyer involved, if not both.
Thankfully, because we're dealing with a transaction right now with a guy who thinks he's a lawyer, and it's just a total disaster. It'll be a miracle if it happens. But
well, the worst of all is somebody with a law degree but who never practiced.
well, we've got one of those too.
What we see less now than we used
Personal
to
injury
is,
lawyer.
it used to be always they kick it off to their personal or their corporate attorney. And,
Yeah.
you know, that's a nightmare for all of us because they don't know what they're doing. And to try and explain to a buyer that, you know, yeah, he's an attorney, but you know, if you're having a heart attack, you don't go to your dentist.
Or vet.
Exactly. So I see a lot less of that now. There seems to be the niche for maritime law, and we don't very often see corporate or personal attorneys get involved.
We run into the problem less with clients that have just general counsel and those who have in-house counsel, and their attitude being, look, I'm paying for you already, and this can't be that hard. So, and that can be interesting at times.
You know, it's funny, on one of these deals right now, it's such a pain in the neck that I don't really want to deal with it, you know? But then I'm thinking, the guy's paying me a lot of money, and I make money by selling my time, but it's still almost not worth it.
But
So,
you get
but
paid by the hour. We don't. We only get paid when they
if the
sell.
deal gets done. The problem is all the other
Well, but
lawyers
you get a
in the
residual.
office
He's getting
are
paid.
busy.
We don't.
That's true.
So I actually only did personally 2 deals in this year, personally. And one of them was a small boat because everybody else was busy, and the other one was a huge boat because everything else was busy. I just had to, you know, go out there and make sure I knew what I was doing again. But
Did it all come back to you?
We've taken on more small deals than we used to. Because I remember we would just refer them out. We'd say, pay the tax, call Kelly, call a dock agent. You don't need us for this. But it's changed recently and over the years. So we do get involved a bit more, but
Yeah, although often to our chagrin.
yes.
You know. Okay, let's move on. Next slide. All right, now we're dealing with the big girls, which is a whole new world. I mean, we have 300 GT gross tons and up, but you know, that can go way up. So even within this category, you're dealing with a variety of situations, some of which are more prominent or more prevalent as you get to the larger boats. Now, 300 gross tons, I guess as everybody knows, tonnage is a measurement of volume, not weight. Displacement is weight. And when you reach 300 gross tons depends on the configuration of the boat, the size of the house. And generally, it's somewhere around 120 feet, more or less. Of course, with a sailing yacht, that's different. And we get into a whole new set of issues. And Stacy, why don't you, what about the COPR and the NTVRP? What are those?
If you have a boat that's over 300 gross tons to enter the United States, you need a COFR, which is a Certificate of Financial Responsibility. It's an add-on to an insurance policy. So it's something we would work with Laura on in order to put in place. At 400 gross tons, you need a non-tank vessel response plan. And that we generally suggest that the client get a management team to handle and work between the captain and the management team because it's a lot of technical things about how much oil is stored on board and that kind of thing. But what's important about those, if say you have a client who closes in the Bahamas or anywhere else, if those 2 documents are not in place, those 2 certificates are not in place, that boat's not clearing
You're
in
not coming back.
at all. Like they used to let you in and just not move. They won't let you in now. So
You have to
COFRs,
include the COFR number and TVRP approval on the notice of arrival, right?
Yeah. So you're not coming back. The COFRs are easy enough to do, and I'm sure that Bob does them, or his team does them for.
He doesn't do
his
it.
Or
firm.
Laura
He
does them.
too.
Yeah, Julie's nodding. Yeah.
But
Julie's
that's
here,
something
that's
that
right. She
most
knows
law
what she's
firms will
doing.
go ahead and handle, and again, like I said, the non-tank. We've run into issues though where we have that happen, and we've been able to kind of piggyback the non-tank.
Yeah, I was going to ask
plan.
you about that. How do you piggyback on an NTVRP?
You need to figure out who has the NTVRP for the current owner. So even if we're the seller, we'll still allow it. So let's say we're using Fairport to handle our non-tank. When the buyer comes to us and they're not going to be able to get it in time because it does take weeks to do, they'll come to us and say, hey, can you help us out? We go to Fairport, they do a letter. So then they end up taking over the management for the new buyer and do a letter saying the seller agrees for that policy to stay in place until the new one is issued. So you have to have parties that are willing to agree to all of that, obviously.
And that's, yeah, it's also something that if you see that as a problem coming up, like you have a boat in the Bahamas, and they want to come back immediately, it's best to provide for that in the contract. So you're not going to be dealing with this issue at the last minute. And Laura, how do we get a COFR?
The CG 5585 form on the Coast Guard website, and the pollution policy is written by a few carriers, WQIS being the biggest
The largest, right?
And it basically says, it's a guarantee. That's why it's not part of your insurance. Your insurance may say we include pollution coverage, but that's a liability. This is actually a guarantee that says, if anything happens, regardless of responsibility, we'll be there. And that's why it's something that the Coast Guard says you must have.
And it's
on
a
these
two-part
boats.
form, right?
Yes, yeah, so.
One for the insurer and one for the
Right, so
owner.
then the insurer advises the Coast Guard along with that application that you filled out, and you're good to go. And I think the Coast Guard application lasts for 2 years, but the insurance policy is 1 year.
You mentioned a select group of insurers. What do you mean by that?
There's about 3 or 4 different pollution insurers that are specific. Lloyd's has,
does it, right?
yeah, with EPG, and then Safe Harbor is another one, not the marinas, and then WQIS. So
We have owners that say that, look, my yacht policy covers pollution damage, but why do I need to pay for another insurer?
that's the reason, because it's a guarantee.
Well,
It's regardless of responsibility,
And Coast Guard will not accept
and Coast Guard won't accept it.
anyone else, yeah, which is.
But I
really-
mean, if you look at steamship, for example, is a P&I carrier, and then there's a number of different clubs that we call clubs that offer high limits of liability, up to $1 billion worth of liability coverage. And they include pollution. So you've got that full limit of pollution coverage on that
Which
policy.
can be a much higher coverage than you get from WQIS typically.
Right, but it still doesn't meet the Coast Guard's requirements. So you still have to get that COFR.
Now, you're talking about the $1.5 billion. How many $1 billion claims have you handled? They're pretty rare,
Knock on wood.
pretty rare.
Yeah.
But those are generally issued by P&I clubs, and right? And what is
Yes.
what is a P&I club?
So I mentioned in that slide, when you get to this level of size of vessel, then you typically have the policies are separate. So you have a hull underwriter. All they do is write the physical damage to the vessel. Then you have a liability underwriter, which is the P&I clubs. Clubs are steamship, ship owners, British Marine, and they are basically the underwriters for all the shipping in the world. And they decided that yachting was cool, and they got into yachting,
Well, yachting is
surprisingly. And yachting is cool. And so they provide the full $500 million limit, and it's a fixed cost premium, which is great because if you're a ship owner, you don't know what your premium is because it depends on everybody that's in the association. You share risk. Well, yachting, you don't share risk. You're just
At the
part of it.
500 level, the billion. If you wanted $1 billion in coverage, then you're
Then you might
You're in the
share.
game.
Then you're
right.
in the game.
And why do they call them clubs?
Because it's a mutual association
Right.
of members.
Yeah, no, just to elaborate on that, the clubs did come out of the commercial world, and it wasn't until, well, not so recently anymore, but a number of years back that they started doing yachts. And a club was just a bunch of owners of ships that got together, and if the claims were in excess of reserves, then the owners had to chip in.
Yeah.
to cover the difference. And that was originally the case, I think, when we started using clubs, even for yachts, but now the lower limit, 500 million, that's no longer a concern. And why is it that clubs are able to offer those sorts of limits when domestic insurers won't go nearly that high?
That's actually a pretty good question, but I think it really does go back to what you said, is how many billion-dollar yacht claims have there been? I mean, the risk is very, 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 very slight that you're going to have a high limit of liability claim on yachts. It typically, caps out somewhere near the value of the vessel. You guys have a wonderful limitation of liability thing that you're able to do.
Yeah.
And all of these are crewed vessels, so you could use that.
Right, although there are a lot of exceptions to limitation of liability.
But, and I'm not exactly sure how they're able to do it, but they do. They offer the $500 million limit.
Yeah, it's incredible. Limitation of liability for the non-lawyers is a maritime concept which says that if a boat is involved in an incident, an accident, that the owner is entitled to limit his liability to the value of the vessel post-accident. And you've even seen this principle used like with wave runner accidents. But the problem is that it's riddled with exceptions, like if the owner was negligent in some fashion, and every good plaintiff's lawyer finds some basis on which to assert they were negligent. We haven't talked much about regulatory concerns. And this is the size range when we see this all the time. And Stacy, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Certificates?
Yeah.
At 300 to 400, you're going to have certain certificates that are required for the boat to have, depending on if it's MCA, how it's classed.
Whether it complies with the flag
yacht
state code.
So, I mean, at this stage, US is kind of out after 300. So you're mostly looking at your foreign flags, Cayman, Marshall, Jamaica. But from 300 to 400, you're going to have certain certificates and certain requirements, 4 to 5, over 5, and then over 1,000 gross tons.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of certificates to list off. But if you'd like a list, you can give me a call.
Yeah, and one thing I don't know that everybody knows is even with private yachts not involved in commercial use, there are certain certificates that you have to have, like 400 gross tons, you have to have an IOPP, International Oil Pollution Prevention certificate, even if you're not engaged in commercial work.
Well, even anti-fouling is
Anti-fouling,
a requirement,
yeah.
regardless
Well,
of
EIAPP.
EIAPPs. If you have an IOPP, you should have a SOPEP, which is the booklet that goes along with the IOPP. Safety radio up to 300, after 400. Safety management, safety equipment. But I think safety management's just commercial.
Yes, it is. The safety equipment, that's a good point, because I want to make sure that everyone is aware of this, and that is that once you're over 300 gross tons, as we discussed earlier, you're now a seagoing motor vessel under US law. And a vessel that's a seagoing motor vessel has to comply with US inspection requirements, as I said before, which is with how the boat is built. And there's an exception to that for foreign flag vessels, but only if they meet the equivalent requirements in their flag state. And a lot of boats, it's becoming less common, between 300 and 500 gross tons, weren't originally built to comply with a commercial code. So they didn't have that proof. And for years and years and years, the Coast Guard just ignored it. And then somebody out in California woke up to it. And technically, if a boat was between 3 and 5 and didn't comply with the commercial code, it couldn't enter US waters. But now flag states will provide what they call a national certificate, which says that you comply with safety equipment standards, which is all the Coast Guard really wants to see. But that was kind of a bullet dodged, because if the Coast Guard hadn't agreed to do that, then those boats would have been frozen out of the United States permanently. Laura, tell us a little bit about crew coverages.
So there is a crossover between protection and indemnity, liability coverage, and crew medical. And this is actually something that I'm still trying to figure out. So crew medical is something that is pretty standard operating procedure for large yachts nowadays, right? I mean, it's a benefit that you want to provide for your crew because it's really hard to get good crew and you want to keep them. But you also have liability coverage that basically provides workers' comp coverage for your yacht crew, because the yacht liability says we provide liability for any liability you may incur for the ownership or operation of the vessel. Broad, right? So there is liability coverage that the owner has, and there's crew medical that the owner has, and there is a crossover between the two. Mm-hmm. What I would just caution everybody is if there is a liability claim that involves an injury to a crew person, make sure that your liability underwriter is aware, and make sure your crew medical underwriter is aware. Because you can get into a situation where there's not notification of one or the other, and there's a denial of coverage.
Well, and as you were suggesting, the potential claims a crewman can make for illness or injury on board the boat are far broader than the crew medical would cover. Like if under the Jones Act, if it applies and there's negligence, then the damages they can sue for are unlimited, and crew medical doesn't pick that up.
Yes.
And so that's absolutely right. Even if somebody's being treated under the crew policy, you put your yacht policy on notice, because it could develop into something more. All right, let's say I'm an owner and I say, I don't care about crew. I can always find somebody who's not going to require a crew policy. And my yacht policy covers me for, from a kind of a workers' comp perspective. So why should I get crew medical?
So there are liability underwriters that say you must have a minimum amount of crew medical insurance in order for us to place this coverage. That's one reason. The other reason is it does give you an additional level of coverage that won't affect your yacht policy exposure. Right. So,
well, or your claims history.
Your claims history, yes.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking was being the big deal. If you have every little incident involving crew reported to your yacht underwriter, then you're going to have an extensive claims history, which you can entirely avoid or largely avoid through crew medical.
Yes, and that's a big point, because underwriters look at frequency and severity. So frequency being how many times are you using your policy, even for little stuff, and then severity being, a big loss.
Mm-hmm. We pay a fortune for insurance for our employees. It really is outrageous. Is it the same with crew medical? How?
If you're from a foreign country, no. It's actually quite
meaning if the crewman's foreign.
If the crew's foreign, yeah.
So do you want us all to move out of the country?
Well, you're working remotely already, Stacy. So.
Ireland it is.
Rob, talking about reporting things, I was thinking about what Laura said earlier about people lying when they apply for insurance.
Bad move.
And it's an incredibly bad move because it's an automatic denial of coverage. And going even beyond lying and relating to reporting, the obligations of a yacht owner to report problems is virtually absolute. And so you need to have this phenomenal relationship with your insurance broker so that and the lines of communication have to be perfect. Because if a system malfunctions on a boat, and maybe it's just an easy fix, right? But you don't tell your insurance broker about it, and then later on, there's maybe even an unrelated issue that leads to an accident. The failure to report, as you are required to do under an insurance policy, can lead to a denial of coverage. Now, then you'll end up getting lawyers to see whether it's relevant or not. But the bottom line is the issue of being honest and fully transparent with respect to insurance is absolutely fundamental, and it can't be overstated, that importance. And the idea of taking shortcuts with regard to it is just the absolutely worst idea you could possibly have.
You're just buying then a worthless piece of paper.
Yes.
It's just never a good idea. So, George, have you seen an increase in buyers at this level to the same extent you've seen in lower size ranges?
Yeah. I mean, the problem is inventory.
It's product.
We talk and talk, whether it's to be built, whether it's floating. You know, right now, there's still probably more buyers than there is
Inventory.
inventory.
Yeah. And are you seeing that both in new builds and used boats?
Yes. Very much so.
Well,
When,
may the demand
particularly,
continue.
where it becomes even more problematic is we've had so many new people to the market, even in this range. You know, a couple transactions at this point that are above 40 meters, new first-time boat buyers. And to tell them that they would have to wait 4 years, you know, to get something is never easy to tell an American that. You know, you can tell a European that, and it's a little more their culture. But
we are impetuous.
yeah, and then yet alone, okay, let's find something, you know, late model used. That was a good idea, but in most cases it doesn't exist, or if it does
Well,
exist,
yeah, I mean, the
it's
pedigree yacht, late model pedigree yachts of a certain size, I mean, they just aren't out there.
Yeah. You know, you can find the stuff off market, but we know what that means.
Right.
It's at a premium.
Yeah. Okay.
I got an email today on a boat we just closed over the 300. And the email today said, oh, hey, we just sold the boat and the tenders, so we don't need to register the tenders now. I mean, it was that quick that it turned over. So he had to have made a pretty penny on that deal
Wow.
for him to sell it that quickly.
Well, I think, again, you know, harking back to 2007 and into 2008, at yards like Trinity, people were flipping slots, not just once, but sometimes twice during a build, and getting paid a premium for it. And Trinity at the time of Lehman Brothers in 2008 had 23 boats under construction. And I think they built maybe another 2. I mean, got 2 new contracts post Lehman Brothers. So, you know, things can change very quickly. All right, well, I think we've gone through it. We still have time for some questions, right, Paul? And, you know, feel free to address your questions to particular members of the panel.
Or not.
And I know this inquisitive group has plenty of questions. Come on, you got all the experts in the world up here.
Hi, guys. Regarding the EIAPP, a two-part question. The first one is, what government authority would enforce the EIAPP, and could we go to them and get dispensation like we did between the 300 and 500 gross tons?
What governmental authority?
I can answer that unless somebody else.
You got the mic.
Yeah, what's interesting is that in the U.S., EIPPs are issued, but they're issued by the Coast Guard on a U.S. flag vessel. Internationally, they're issued by class or the manufacturers. Which is it, Stacy?
Both.
Both. Okay. And there is no workaround as yet. If you don't have them, you don't have them. And fortunately, with the EIAPPs, as opposed to the Coast Guard certificates of, the EPA certificates of conformity, if you don't have one, you can generally get one. Because engine manufacturers have always taken care to ensure that their engines meet international requirements. Where it becomes more of an issue is with EPA certificates of conformity. Because if you have boats that were built in Europe and weren't built with a US market in mind, typically they don't have certificates of conformity. And it is very, very difficult and generally impossible to get a certificate of conformity issued after the fact. So it's really, that is something that is more of a trap for the unwary more than the EIAPPs. EIAPPs is just generally a matter of cost.
But Rob, tell them what the workaround is.
Well, the workaround on the EPA certificates of conformity is you go foreign. Because the EPA requirements are only requirements for boats under US flag. Not if you're under foreign flag, but where that becomes an issue, you say, okay, I'm gonna go foreign, is if there comes a time when you want to import that boat, you can't import it into the United States unless it's EPA compliant.
Yeah, so it becomes an issue if you want to sell it to somebody who says, I want to fly an American flag.
Yeah.
And that happens every once in a while, but it's usually with a less experienced buyer, right?
Well, especially at this size range.
Yeah.
You know, because if you get up over 300 gross tons, well, if we're talking about the larger boats, as I said earlier, you're a seagoing motor vessel, and you're not going to be able to US flag with one exception. So you're going to be under foreign flag anyway. But if you wanted to be able to import that boat for purposes of sale, you couldn't. But you can now bring the boat in to a foreign trade zone and offer it for sale there without having to worry about importation or a boat show bond. So those remain
I think it's
possibilities.
mentioned though with the FTZ, you can no longer close in the FTZ. We used to be able to,
Good
and now
point.
those boats have to go to the Bahamas, and that's where we were running into COFA and non-tank issues because we didn't realize we were going to have to. Coast Guard changed it. We had all these boats in there, and we weren't able to close there, so that's when we found the workaround for the non-tank.
Right.
I don't mean to beat a dead horse on this EIAPP topic, but does that get lost like duty gets lost if it's not taken care of with offshore closings and coming back? And if that document, for instance, does it hold forever if it's tied to the boat? Or per sale, can it eventually get changed if there's some change in the engines or the gens or whatever it is? Does it have
I'm
to
not
get
sure I fully understood the
recertified?
question. The EIAPP is a permanent certificate, and the only time that would change is if you modified the engine.
You answered them, thanks.
And something else to point out is that the EIPP requirement applies to engines and yachts that have a keel laid date after January 1 of 2000. And you might get a boat that's earlier than that, becoming increasingly rare. But even then, if the engine was modified in a way post-2000 that would affect its emissions, then all of a sudden you now have to have an EIAPP.
Or if you change the flag, you would have to reissue, correct?
No.
So if you have a Cayman EIAPP, that's not necessary, that
I
won't
don't know.
apply
I don't think
to.
there's a difference. Yeah, you're right with most regulatory certificates, but EIAPP, which is an IMO-related requirement, it's the same certificate for every flag, as far as I know.
If you're going to US flag,
U.S. is different,
you have to,
because then you need one issued by the Coast Guard.
and I was successful in getting MTU to replacard a pair of engines recently, and Bob's office was involved in that. So that was
I'm sorry, to do what?
They replacarded the motors. MTU replacarded the motors because
Yeah.
they did meet US EIAPP, but they were under Cayman, so they had an international placarding on the engines. And they did reissue. They did provide the US EIAPP placards to go on the motors,
Right.
the decals, and that was quite a task to get done, but we were able to get it done.
But that was just going from from international to US on the EIPP, or was it also an EPA certificate of conformity?
International to US.
Yeah, because getting an EPA certificate of conformity is the difficult part. We've done it, but it's not something you can always count on being able to do.
So I wanted to make a comment, kind of change gears to escrow responsibility. And a couple of years ago, when I opened up my company, it dawned on me while I was setting up my escrow account, because my first deal was a pretty substantial one, and I had over $1 million I was putting into an escrow of a client's. And I'm like, well, what happens if I get in a freak accident? You know, get run over by a carload of midgets or something. I mean,
Is that going around?
I don't have. In that case, what happens to the money? Because if I'm the signer, so I wanted to make sure I have 2 other signers that are in my office that can access and
Smart.
return the. But I don't think a lot of people, because I do deal with quite a few other people, and I bring this up to them. What do? You know, how's your escrow account set up? It's amazing how many guys and gals, but they only have themselves as the signer on their escrow account for these smaller brokerages. And that's
Yeah.
something I just wanted to bring to light. And also, I always, pretty much in entirety on my bigger boat deals, I insist that the client puts their money in an attorney's escrow account. And more, because the complexity of these larger transactions, I want to make sure that I'm insulated, the client's insulated.
And the attorney's on the hook.
In effect, but that's your forte, and you go
Being on the
through
hook.
everything so thoroughly. If it's made it through the attorneys, the
No, I
maritime
agree with you.
attorneys,
That is a smart thing to do. But just to look at the question you raised about if you have a single member LLC, say, that owns the business, and that member is also the manager, and you have a bank account where only that person is on the account. It's not that the money is frozen when he dies, but it's difficult because his estate would then take over the membership of the LLC. They would have to appoint a new manager. That new manager would have to go down to the bank and change the account. I mean, it can be done. It's just it's a real hassle.
But meanwhile, your client's money is held.
Yeah, what do you care? You're dead.
Thank you, carload of midgets.
Back on the EAIPP certificates, can we as brokers list a boat for sale and put in the listing the disclosure that EAIPP certificates are not available and do not convey with the sale of this particular
Yeah,
yacht?
just be careful saying not available, because they may be available but at a cost. And you can say that it does not currently have EIPP certificates.
But do they need to? Why would you want to do that?
Just to defer the responsibility of, it being, if I'm a listing agent and it's the responsibility of my seller to provide those EAIPPs, and he either doesn't want to go through the expense of it, or it's a long drawn out process. If I nip that in the bud in the beginning and say, we don't have them, we're not going to get them, so it's not part of the transaction. Good luck to you. You can get them at a later date at your expense.
Okay, so we just have to think about that just a little more. If you put that in the listing, right, you're going to actually have to put it in the contract, right? Because it could be in the listing, but if it's not in the contract, it's irrelevant what the listing says. So you have to be careful there. Okay.
Well, generally, the way we do it, I don't know if in all brokerage transactions you see this, we have a document list. And if we don't have them, we don't put them on the list. And if the buyer complains, then it becomes a matter of negotiation who has to go out and get them. But if you put them on the list and you don't have them, then you've just bought a pair of certificates. Right.
Yeah, so in your role as a broker, right, you can say that if you want to alert the world to the fact that the certificates aren't there. But then if you're preparing the contract, presumably on the IYBA form, then you're going to put that in the additional provisions clause if you're preparing it.
Understood. Thank you.
Before we leave EIPPs, I just want to make one comment that I think also gets overlooked. Is the requirement applies to generators too, because they have a diesel engine.
Yeah.
And it just is with generators, less likely that you'll be over 130 kWs on smaller boats at least.
I don't know that I have a question, but I want to share experience that just recently happened. I had a 2013 Canadian flagged Asmet. Owner wanted to import it for sale. To pay the import duty, you need EIAPP, or you cannot import the boat. I was dealing with Diesel Services of America and asked them, can you guys get this for me? And they put me in touch with somebody from MAN, and they sent it to me at no cost, no problem. It was there in a day. So
Now, we were talking about EIAPPs or?
EIAPP, yep.
Yeah. Well, different manufacturers have different policies. And frankly, what many of these manufacturers charge for EIAPPs is just a
Exorbitant.
total ripoff.
Yeah.
There was no charge.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's
You were
man's
dealing with
credit.
man. So.
Yeah, and you know, the answer is that shame on them for having sold the engines to the distributor without EIPP certificates.
Interestingly, the first time I ever had to obtain those certificates, I had to get them from MAN for a boat being exported to Japan, and I had the same experience. I called MAN, they gave me the technical specs right out of Germany. It was accepted by the Japanese government because it was before it was being required here, and it was a done deal. Next time I wanted to send a boat over there, it had Caterpillars in it. It was a little bit
Pay the
different
man.
experience. Yes, it was. Other questions? I know that carload of midgets put everybody kind of at a stop on the back foot there. You know, I have that's a freak accident. That's another carload. A question that I have, and I wonder if it isn't a can of worms, but you know, Andy brings up an interesting point. You have the employing broker is licensed in the state of Florida, and we have a statute that, Chapter 326, that regulates some of the requirements of that employing broker. In the event that something were to happen to the employing broker, there's nothing in the state statute that talks about the escrow, the accounts, whose responsibilities they are. It almost is a free-for-all in the eye of the state, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it is actually, and it's one of the reasons why it makes sense to use a law firm, I think, as much as you can. Lawyers are regulated in, you know, a lot more than yacht brokers. And it's highly unusual for there just to be one signature on a trust account unless you've got just a solo practice, right? If you've got a solo practice. But the law, the rules that regulate law firms actually require you to have a succession plan. In other words, you have to have a written plan. You're supposed to. I'm not sure.
Sole practitioners now.
No, all law firms. All.
We need a succession plan?
Yes, you do. But it's not the succession of who's running the law firm. It's what happens to your files if you should become incapacitated.
Yeah, but I thought that was a sole practitioner because with the firm, the files belong to the firm. I'm fighting you on this because we don't have a succession plan.
Well,
you're a good lawyer, Rob.
For a small fee, maybe you buy me lunch or something. We'll talk about what we've done.
All right.
But the point is, you're better protected, I think, when any significant amount of money is in a law firm's account.
I think that's right. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. One of the things in our Chapter 326 review that Nick was talking about earlier, and the work that we're doing with the state, David Maass and some of the guys from Bob Allen's office were very helpful in structuring our white paper that we originally put forward, and we continue to, all of the attorneys in both firms continue to give us input on that. And one of the things that many of you may not know is that in the legal profession, your escrow account is an interest-bearing account, and that interest is automatically swept by the bank, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
It's automatically swept into a trust fund that's governed by the state, and that trust fund, the purpose of it is to provide relief to people that have been wronged. So there's money there.
It's one of the purposes.
One of the purposes.
It's to provide legal services to the poor,
Okay.
primarily.
Yeah.
And then there's that component.
And if you think about it, even though interest rates are pretty minuscule right now, you're talking about significant sums of money when you lump together all of the escrow accounts of all the attorneys in the state of Florida, for example. One of the
Paul,
things,
there is an exception, and that rule applies to short-term deposits, right? So if you have some weird circumstance where you're going to park $1 million for 6 months, you can carve that out,
Yeah.
set up a separate interest-bearing account, and the interest goes to the client, right?
I'm glad you
We
said
used to
that.
do
'cause
that, but right now, the
Interest rates are so low, it's
I mean,
irrelevant.
it's more
Yeah.
trouble than it's
Yeah.
worth. I mean, our trust account, we're getting 0.0 something
Right.
percent.
I'm glad you said that, Bob, because I was just getting ready to do that. So that was a good piece of advice. Do we have any other quick questions? One more. Royce.
I've missed a few of these seminars, so I got to make up with questions to get this free legal advice. And hats off to Bob Zarkin for starting this whole thing 40 years ago.
Hey, Bob.
Anyhow, kind of I asked Jeff a couple questions, and I think somebody said after that that the Department of Revenue is not very aggressive on enforcing things right now, and I might have got that wrong. So I'm just going to go into my question. Okay, my guy buys a boat in the Mid-Atlantic. He goes to the Bahamas. He's planning on just kind of stopping through Florida a little bit before he goes to the Gulf of Mexico over a 6-month period. Well, let's say he decides he doesn't like the rebuilt marina and now he stays in Florida. At what point does he fess up to the state and say, I think I owe you use tax? Or does he just wait and get caught? And is there a penalty if he waits and gets caught?
Well, the answer is, it depends. No, what I mean by that, if you have once upon a time, sales and use tax was a major part of our practice. You get 6% sales tax on a $10 million yacht. I mean, that's real money. And now obviously it's capped at $18,000. And it's because the game's no longer worth the candle that the revenue has dropped or essentially reduced its enforcement efforts. But the answer is if no boat is subject to use tax until it's been here 20 days. You get a 20-day free period. You can extend that if a boat goes into the shipyard under safe harbor form you have to fill out. But you only can do that once a year. If a boat is U.S. flagged and owned by a non-Floridian, then it can stay here for up to 90 consecutive days on any one visit and not more than 183 days in total during any rolling 12-month period. And if it's under foreign flag and has a cruising license, it can stay indefinitely for as long as the license is valid, unless and until the boat's imported into the U.S. But we just don't see use tax enforcement anymore. I mean, that's not an excuse for not paying the tax. I'm just saying it really has fallen off dramatically. Yeah, no, there's a penalty, but absent fraud, it doesn't exceed 50% of the tax. So instead of 18, you pay 27.
Ouch. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for an informative session. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Rob, for moderating that. Bob Allen and Laura Sherrod and Stacy Perry and George Jousma. Great. It's amazing the amount of information that's being dispensed here today. And just before I send you to lunch, because you're right on the mark, you are on schedule. We're going to be going to lunch. I'll take you to lunch in just a second here. But I want to mention one of our sponsors, seminar sponsors, is AMI Kids. And I'm going to ask Roger Hurd if he would come up here and give us a short address. Roger, you are there. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, Roger Hurd.
Thanks, Bob. I'll be really quick because I know everybody's hungry, so am I. We still have a few of these limited edition cheap travel mugs out on the table, so get one. Make them go away, please. Statistics. Jason was talking about statistics earlier. 52 years That's how long AMI Kids has been working with troubled teenagers and finding them a new lease on life. 48 of those years, the marine industry, the IYBA, the FYBA, the brokerage industry has been supporting us with donated boats. Those donated boats go directly to funding our currently 45 schools in 10 states. To date, we have helped about 145,000 kids find a new lease on life, and about 80% of those kids never reoffended again. Those kids would be incarcerated if they did not find the help. So all of the money that we get from the donation and the lease and sale of boats goes to support those schools. There is no greater cause than helping our kids. 80, that's how many days are left in this calendar year, this tax year. You need to talk to your clients. Unless you are intimately in knowledge of what their financial situation is right now, you have no idea whether they can use a tax write-off. 9 out of 10 of our customers do it out of convenience. Somewhat philanthropic, but mostly convenience. The boat has been on the market for a while. I can't get the money that I want for it. I want to move on to my next boat, or I'm getting out of boating, excuse me, or whatever the case may be. You don't know what their motivation is. Perhaps they just had a huge capital gains that they need to offset. Perhaps they've had a death in the family. Perhaps they just got the news that they're going to be leaving this world and they want to leave their family without any issues. Have the talk with them about donation. If you don't know how to have that talk, please talk to me, talk to Lee Hutton back here. If you need to talk about appraisal amounts, talk to Jason Dunbar or Norm LeBlanc or one of those, Malcolm Elliott, about what appraisal values for the boats will be. You'd be surprised how much that value can get to, where in many, many cases, the people that donate the boats for us write off as much money as they do in an outright sale minus commissions. So there's no loss to them. Those tax dollars, the write-off is money. So please help us out. You need more information, see Lee or myself. Thank you.
Just before we go to lunch, I have one question. Are there any birthdays in the room? Raise your hand if you're having a birthday today. Well, we have Joe Stanley and Paul Flannery. Do we have any more? Let's send them off. Let's go to lunch with a nice, good feeling. Let's everybody sing happy birthday. Paul, Joe, stand up. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Paul and Joe. Happy birthday to you. Paul, you look remarkable for 89 years old, I've got to tell you right now. Okay, lunch is just past the stairwell. We'll see you back in 1 hour, all right? Enjoy.